So today's word is preaching. But before we get started, a couple of disclaimers. First, I have nothing against preachers. I know several personally, including within the family. My mom babysat for the preacher of the church where I grew up with. This lesson is not an attack on preachers. Second, I don't want anyone to say that I'm against preaching. Nothing could be further from the truth. Preaching is essential to spreading the gospel. But with those two disclaimers stated, I do believe we have a poor mindset when it comes to preaching, a mindset that doesn't line up very well with how the word is used in the Bible. So let's jump into the Bible. Let's start in Acts 5 and verse 42, which says, "And every day in the temple and from house to house, they did not cease teaching and preaching that the Christ is Jesus." This verse refers to the apostles. Notice that it says they were both teaching and preaching. So that makes it pretty clear that teaching and preaching are not the same thing. There's no reason this verse would mention both of them if they were the same thing. Acts 15:35 and 1 Timothy 5:17 also refer to both teaching and preaching within the same verse as two different activities. We'll take up teaching in the next video, but today we're going to stick to preaching. So if I ask you to describe for me a preacher, that is someone who does preaching, what would you say? How would you describe a preacher? Don't overthink it. What are your first thoughts that come to your mind? My guess is that a majority of you think about the person that stands behind the pulpit on Sunday morning and maybe Sunday evening and delivers a sermon. He preaches. And thus, that becomes our view of what preaching is. Preaching is delivering a Bible-based sermon to the congregation that meets regularly at that place and time. That's where the vast majority of us encounter preaching. That is our idea of what preaching is. And if you've watched any of the earlier videos in this series, you know now that I'm going to ask how well that lines up with how the word preaching is used in the Bible. And since the word preaching is included in this word shift series of lessons, you can rightly conclude that there may be an issue, that we've shifted the word preaching as used in the Bible to something different in our lives today. In other words, when the word preaching is used in the Bible, does it refer to someone standing behind a pulpit in a church building, delivering a sermon to the members of that congregation? The short answer is no. No. So let's look at that word in the Bible. It's used in one form or another a total of 76 times in the New Testament. Matthew 3:1 says, John the Baptist was preaching in the desert. Matthew 11:1 says, Jesus went on from there to teach and preach in their cities. Mark 1:38 says, let us go on to the next towns that I may preach there also. Mark 16:20 says, they went out and preached everywhere. And lots of other verses just like this throughout the Gospels. Preaching was something that was being done in the desert, in the villages, in the cities. But these verses are all from before the establishment of the church. That happens in Acts chapter 2. So let's see if preaching after the establishment of the church takes on a different context or role. Acts 8:4 says, those who were scattered went about preaching the word. Acts 8:40 says, he preached the gospel to all the towns he came until he came to Caesarea. Acts 9:28 says, he went in and out among them at Jerusalem, preaching boldly. We can go on and see the same thing again and again. through 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, among others. Preaching out and about within the community, not as something that was reserved for when the church got together. What you see in the New Testament, both before the church was instituted and after, is a very consistent pattern of the preaching being something that was done out in the community. What you won't see is preaching being the word that was used for what was done when the church assembled. Those words are words such as a lesson, a revelation, or a prophecy, or an interpretation. Why wouldn't the word preaching be used in those situations? After all, that's the word and the way we use it today. Turns out the answer to that is pretty logical. The Greek word translated as preaching means to proclaim a message, to herald the good news. This means to share something with those who haven't heard it, to those that aren't aware of it, that haven't had the opportunity to hear it. That's why we consistently see the word used in the New Testament referring to sharing the message throughout the community. That's simply what the word means. But when we preach at an assembly of the church, referred to in the Bible several times as the assembly of the saints, the assembly of people that have not only heard the gospel message, but have responded and accepted the gospel message. So preaching no longer applies to this situation. There's no reason to share a message that people haven't heard to a group of people that have already heard it. It's actually illogical. To use the word in this sense actually defies the very meaning of the word. I hope you understand what I'm saying. I really don't know how else to describe it. But what's the big deal? Why does this even matter? So we don't use a word exactly the right way. Big deal, right? Jesus says in Matthew 28:19, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." Go. He says to go. He doesn't say to have a meeting, put up a sign by the road to let people know when you meet and then hope they come. Build it and they will come is a line in a movie. It's not a line in the Bible. Preaching in the Bible is to be done out in the world where the people need to hear the gospel message. It's not something reserved for the assembly of the church, of the saints. We've already heard and accepted the message. So, one more word out of the Bible that we've allowed to shift in meaning to something that doesn't line up with how God used it in His message to us. No wonder our churches are shrinking. If we don't even use the word preaching the right way, what are the chances that we'll actually do it the right way? Romans 10:14 and 15 says, "How then will they call on Him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in Him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent?" Where are they to be sent? The New Testament says the cities, the villages, the towns, the neighborhoods, the community. The Bible makes it very clear that that's where the preaching is supposed to happen. It's time that we start speaking of preaching the right way and start doing it the right way instead of sequestering it for ourselves inside our comfortable church buildings. Preaching. One more word that has shifted in meaning. And we need to shift it back to its original meaning like God intended it. Next time we'll look at the word teaching. We'll see if its meaning has maybe shifted as well. Thanks for listening. See you next time.